Elena Crawford arrived in New Mexico Territory in 1865 with $8, 2 children, and a half-built cabin with no fireplace. The math was brutal. A frontier family needed 8 cords of firewood to survive winter. Cutting 1 cord took 3 days. She had 7 weeks. She had never swung an axe. The nearest timber was 4 miles away. Buying wood cost $10 per cord. She had $8 total. When the January blizzard hit, 25 degrees below zero for 3 days, neighbors burned their furniture. One man froze in his chair. Elena's cabin stayed 62 degrees. Her floor radiated heat from a fire that burned out 6 hours before. She had discovered something the skeptics called impossible. The blizzard had raged for 3 days. In the Sangre de Cristo foothills of New Mexico Territory, January of 1867 brought temperatures that killed livestock where they stood. 15 degrees below zero. Wind that cut through cabin walls like they were paper. In the settlement of Cañada Bonita, chimneys that had smoked steadily all winter began to go dark. The Hendricks place, 3 miles east, stopped smoking on the second day. The Peterson cabin followed. Families huddled under every blanket they owned, burning furniture, burning floorboards, watching their breath crystallize in the air while their children shivered. One cabin stood apart from the others. No smoke rose from its chimney. From the outside, it looked abandoned or worse. Amos Whitmore forced his way through chest-deep snow to reach it. He'd promised himself he wouldn't let the Crawford widow and her children freeze to death alone. He'd bring the bodies back for proper burial. That was the least a Christian man could do. He pounded on the door with numb fists. Silence. He pounded again. The door opened. Warmth poured out like water from a broken dam. Elena Crawford stood in the doorway. Behind her, her 2 children sat on a stone floor playing with carved wooden animals. The air inside felt like springtime. The floor, Whitmore could see it radiating heat, could feel it through his frozen boots. She had not added fuel to the fire in 6 hours. "Come in, Mr. Whitmore," Elena said. "The floor's warm." He stepped inside, speechless, and placed his palm against the stone. 74 degrees. He'd learn that number later. In that moment, he knew only one thing. Everything he'd believed about survival in this territory was wrong. But 14 months earlier, every settler in the valley had agreed on one thing. Elena Crawford would not survive her first winter alone. They were almost right. William Crawford died of cholera in Santa Fe on the 3rd day of October, 1865. He'd been hauling freight from Missouri, trying to earn enough to finish the cabin he'd started on their homestead claim. The sickness took him in 48 hours. Elena received word from a stranger passing through, a man who'd helped bury her husband in a mass grave outside the city. She was 30 years old. She had 2 children. She had $8 in coin, a wagon with a cracked axle, 2 oxen too weak to pull it, and 160 acres of scrubland in the foothills that her husband had claimed just 3 months before his death. The cabin he'd started had 4 walls and no roof, no fireplace, no floor, just bare earth and the frame of something that might have been a home. Elena stood in the doorway of that skeleton structure on the morning she learned she was a widow, and she calculated. 7-year-old Thomas held her hand. 4-year-old Sarah clung to her skirt. Both children were still recovering from the fever that had nearly killed them on the trail west. 7 weeks until first frost. That was what the neighbors said. 7 weeks to finish a roof, build a fireplace, and stockpile enough firewood to survive 5 months of winter. She had never spent a winter west of Missouri. She had never swung an axe in her life. Reverend Marcus Holt rode out to the Crawford claim on the 4th day after William's death. He was 53 years old, and had buried 17 settlers in 5 years. Men, women, children, entire families frozen in their cabins or starved before spring. He considered it his Christian duty to speak plainly. He found Elena on her knees in the dirt, trying to dig a foundation for a fireplace with a broken spade. Mrs. Crawford. He dismounted slowly, watching her. You need to understand something. Elena didn't stop digging. I'm listening, Reverend. You need 8 cords of firewood to survive winter here. Minimum, seasoned wood, dry. He paused. Do you know what a cord is? I know what a cord is. Then you know that cutting, hauling, and splitting one cord takes an experienced man 3 full days of labor, with a proper axe, with a wagon to haul timber. He looked at her broken spade, her thin arms, the 2 children watching from the cabin doorway. You have 7 weeks. You would need to produce a cord of wood every 6 days, working dawn to dusk, just to meet the minimum. Elena kept digging. The spade scraped against rock. She tried to pry it loose. The nearest timber is 4 miles up that canyon. The Reverend pointed west. You cannot cut it alone. You cannot haul it alone. Even if you could, you would have no time to finish the roof, store food, tend the children, or do any of the 100 other things a settler must do before winter. The rock came loose. Elena tossed it aside and kept digging. Mrs. Crawford, I've seen this before. The mathematics do not lie. A woman alone cannot survive a winter here, not in these conditions. Elena stopped. She looked up at him, squinting against the morning sun. Then what do you suggest, Reverend? Sell the claim. Take what you can get. $20, perhaps $30 if the buyer is generous. Take your children to Santa Fe. Find work as a seamstress or take in laundry. You're young. Enough. You could make a life. And if I don't want to leave? The Reverend's face shifted. Something uncomfortable passed through his expression. There is another option. Samuel Griggs lost his wife 2 winters past. He has a sound cabin, 12 cords of seasoned wood stacked and waiting. He has expressed interest in. I know what Samuel Griggs has expressed interest in. Elena's voice went flat. I've seen how he looks at me. I've heard what people whisper about how his first wife died. Whispers are not facts, Mrs. Crawford. And facts are not destiny, Reverend. She returned to her digging. I'll find another way. Marcus Holt stood there for a long moment. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and the promise of cold. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. There is no other way, he said finally. This is mathematics, Mrs. Crawford. Cold mathematics. 8 cords minimum, 7 weeks. No timber within reach. No money to buy it. No husband to cut it. Mounted his horse. I'll pray for you, but prayer won't keep your children warm when the temperature drops below 0. He rode away. Elena watched him go, then looked down at the hole she dug. 6 inches deep. A fireplace foundation needed 3 feet. Thomas appeared at her elbow. Mama, are we going to be all right? She put her arm around him. She could feel his ribs through his shirt. The fever had taken weight from him that he couldn't afford to lose. Yes, she said. We're going to be all right. She had no idea how. The answer came 3 weeks later, and it came from a direction Elena never expected. Dolores Archuleta lived 3 miles north of the Crawford claim, in an adobe house that her great-great-grandfather had built when the Spanish still controlled the territory. She was 64 years old, weathered like driftwood, and she had survived more winters in this valley than Elena had been alive. Elena walked those 3 miles on a November morning, her children left with strict instructions to stay inside. She was going to beg. She never begged for anything in her life, but her children were hungry and cold, and the half-built cabin offered no protection from the wind that had begun to bite. She would ask Dolores for firewood, for food, for anything. What she found when she arrived changed everything. The Archuleta house had no fireplace that Elena could see, no iron stove, no woodpile stacked against the exterior walls. Yet when Dolores opened the door, warmth flooded out, rich, steady warmth that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Come in, come in." Dolores took Elena's hands in her own. "You're frozen, child. Sit. I make you tea." Elena sat on a wooden chair and looked around, confused. The room was warm, genuinely warm. She could feel heat rising through her boots, through the soles of her feet. The floor itself seemed to be radiating warmth. She knelt down and placed her palm flat against the clay tiles. Hot, not just warm. Hot enough that she had to move her hand. "Senora Archuleta, where is your fire?" Dolores laughed. It was a sound like wind through dry leaves. "Come, I show you." She led Elena outside around the back of the adobe house. There, built into an exterior wall, sat a small stone structure no bigger than a bread oven. A metal plate covered its opening. Black soot stained the wall above it. Dolores lifted the metal plate. Inside, gray ash. No flame, no embers, no heat that Elena could feel. "The fire has been out for 4 hours," Dolores said. "And yet my floor's warm, yes? My house is warm. I do not freeze." She smiled. "This is the gloria." Gloria. "In Castile, where my grandmother's grandmother was born, the winters are like here. Long, cold. 8 months of winter, they say, and little wood. The forests, they are far. So the Castilians, they learned something. They learned to make the stone remember the fire." Elena stared at the cold ash in the firebox. "I don't understand." Dolores led her back inside. In the corner of the main room, she pulled back a woven rug to reveal a clay tile that was slightly different from the others, darker, with finger grooves along its edge. She lifted it. Beneath the floor, Elena saw channels, brick channels, 8 inches wide, blackened with generations of soot. They ran in a zigzag pattern beneath the floor, from the wall where the exterior firebox sat to the opposite wall, where a small chimney rose through the roof. "The fire burns outside," Dolores said. "Hot and quick. The smoke, it does not go up. It goes under, through these channels, across the whole floor, then up the chimney on the other side." She gestured at the warm tiles surrounding them. "The stone, it drinks the heat. All that heat from the fire, the stone takes it in. And then, for hours and hours, the stone gives it back. Slow, gentle, like the sun warming a rock in summer, and the rock staying warm after the sun goes down." Elena's mind raced. "How long? How long does the floor stay warm?" "If I fire it in the morning, the floor is warm until the next morning, 12 hours, sometimes more if I build the fire big." But Elena thought of the Reverend's mathematics. 8 cords of wood, 7 weeks. Impossible numbers. The wood. You must burn so much wood. Dolores picked up a bundle from the corner. Dried grass, corn stalks, twisted sagebrush, things Elena had seen scattered across the prairie, things she'd thought of as waste. "For the Gloria, you do not need wood." Dolores put the bundle in Elena's hands. "You need anything that burns. The fire is hot but fast. 20 minutes, 30 minutes. The smoke goes through, the stone catches the heat. The fire is done. Straw, grass, brush, even dried cow chips when nothing else is available." She shrugged. "My grandmother never burned wood in her Gloria. Why would she? Wood is precious. Grass is everywhere." Elena looked at the dried grass in her hands. She thought of the endless prairie surrounding her claim, the corn stalks from the garden William had planted before he died, the sagebrush that covered every hillside, despised by the settlers as a nuisance. She didn't have wood. She had never had wood. She had everything. You're going to burn grass. Amos Whitmore stood in the doorway of Elena's half-built cabin, watching her dig out the dirt floor. Underground, in trenches, and this is going to heat your home through winter. Elena didn't stop digging. That's correct, Mr. Whitmore. And you learned this from old Dolores Archuleta, who learned it from her grandmother, who learned it in Spain 100 years ago. Several hundred years ago, actually. It's called a gloria. The Romans used something similar. Elena's shovel struck a rock. She knelt to pry it loose. The principle is simple. Hot smoke passes through channels beneath a stone floor. The stone absorbs the heat. The stone radiates the heat for hours after the fire goes out. Whitmore was 41 years old. He'd survived 3 New Mexico winters, buried 1 child to pneumonia, and considered himself an expert on what it took to live in this territory. He watched the widow digging trenches in her own floor and felt something between pity and alarm. Mrs. Crawford, the Archuletas have been building that way for generations. They know things you don't. They use adobe, not wood framing. Adobe holds heat. Wood burns. He gestured at the half-finished timber walls surrounding them. You're going to run hot smoke beneath a wooden cabin. You'll smoke yourself out at best, burn the whole thing down at worst. The channels will be lined with stone. The floor will be stone. The smoke won't touch the wood. You've never laid stone in your life. I've never dug a trench before last week either. Elena straightened up, wiping sweat from her forehead. I learned quickly, Mr. Whitmore. He stared at her. Mud on her dress. Blisters, visible on her palms. That stubborn set to her jaw that he'd seen in settlers just before they got themselves killed. You're wagering your children's lives on something you saw one time in an old woman's house. I'm wagering my children's lives on the only option I have. Elena returned to her digging. Reverend Holt gave me 2 choices. Abandon my claim or marry Samuel Griggs. I'm taking a third choice. There is no third choice. That's what makes a choice. Then help me dig, Mr. Whitmore, or leave me to it. He stood there for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away, shaking his head. Elena watched him go. Then she looked at the trench she'd dug. 6 feet completed, another 34 feet to go. The ground was rocky, her shovel was dull, and she was so tired she could barely lift her arms. 4 weeks until the ground froze solid. After that, no more digging. She resumed her work. Word spread through the valley the way word always spread, through gossip at the general store, through whispers after church, through the knowing looks that women exchanged when they thought Elena wasn't watching. The Crawford widow's gone mad. She's digging up her own floor, planning to burn grass for heat. Grass. Those poor children, they'll be orphans by Christmas. Elena heard it all. She heard it when she walked the 22 miles to Las Vegas to trade her best dress, the one she'd worn when she married William, for a cast-iron plate to cover the firebox. She heard it when she bartered 2 of her hens for enough clay to seal the stone channels. She heard it in the silence that fell whenever she entered the general store, and in the 2 loud conversations that started up again as soon as she left. But the worst came from Samuel Griggs. He arrived at her claim on a gray November afternoon, riding a horse worth more than everything Elena owned combined. Reverend Holt rode beside him. They found her knee-deep in a trench, covered in mud, her hands bleeding through makeshift bandages. Mrs. Crawford. Griggs didn't dismount. He looked down at her from his horse like a man examining livestock at auction. The Reverend tells me you've rejected his advice. Elena kept working. I've chosen a different path, Mr. Griggs. That's not the same as rejection. I hear you're building some kind of Mexican contraption, burning grass underground. He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. A woman shouldn't be doing this kind of work. A woman should have a man to provide for her. I had a man. He died. And now you don't, which is exactly my point. Griggs leaned forward in his saddle. I have a warm house, Mrs. Crawford, a solid roof, 12 cords of wood seasoned and waiting. Your children could sleep in real beds, eat real meals. You wouldn't have to crawl in the dirt like an animal. Elena straightened up. She was still holding her shovel, more spade than shovel now, worn down to a stub by the rocky ground. Mr. Griggs, my husband has been dead less than 2 months. Propriety demands I wait at least a year before considering any arrangements. Propriety. He said the word like it tasted bad. Propriety won't keep you warm. Propriety won't keep your children alive when the temperature drops to 20 below. His eyes moved to Thomas and Sarah, who had stopped playing to watch from the cabin doorway. Look at them, thin as rails. One bad cold and they're in the ground beside their father. Elena's grip tightened on the shovel. You should leave now, Mr. Griggs. The offer stands. He gathered his reins. It's a generous offer. Some would say more generous than you deserve, given your circumstances. He glanced at the mud-filled trenches, the half-finished walls, the pathetic pile of stones she'd gathered for the floor. You have until the first hard freeze to change your mind. After that, he shrugged. After that, nature will make the decision for you. He rode away. Reverend Holt lingered a moment longer, looking like he wanted to say something. Then he followed. That night, Elena sat with her children in the corner of the roofless cabin, blankets wrapped around all 3 of them against the cold. Thomas pressed against her side. Sarah slept in her lap. Mama? Thomas's voice was small in the darkness. Mr. Griggs says we're going to die. Elena pulled him closer. Mr. Griggs is wrong. But everyone says everyone is wrong. She could see her breath in the moonlight. The stars above were sharp and cold, indifferent to the struggles of one widow and 2 children on 160 acres of scrubland. I've seen something, Thomas. A way to stay warm that doesn't need wood. It's going to work. And when it does, no one... She looked toward the dark shape of Griggs's cabin on the distant ridge. No one will ever tell us what we can and cannot do again. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Promise? Promise. She meant it. Even though the trenches were only half or dug, even though she had no idea if the stone floor would hold or crack, even though her hands were bleeding and her body ached and she had 3 weeks left to finish work that should have taken 3 months, she meant it because she had no other choice. The first week of construction nearly killed her. Elena woke before dawn each day and worked until full dark. The trenches had to be 8 inches deep, 12 inches wide, running in a zigzag pattern to maximize the contact between hot smoke and stone. The floor of her main room measured 16 by 14 feet. She needed 40 feet of channels to cover it properly, 6 feet per day. That was her pace. 6 feet of back-breaking labor, digging through soil that seemed to be more rock than dirt. She broke 2 shovel handles. She wore through 1 pair of shoes. By the end of the first week, her hands were so blistered she had to wrap them in rags to grip the shovel at all. Thomas helped. 7 years old, still thin from his fever, He carried buckets of dirt from the trenches to a growing pile outside, his own hands blistered. Elena cried the first time she saw the raw skin on his palms, but she didn't tell him to stop. She couldn't. She needed him. Sarah helped too, in her way. 4 years old, she gathered small stones and stacked them in piles. She mixed clay with water in a wooden bucket, stomping it with her bare feet until it was smooth enough to use as mortar. She sang while she worked, songs her father had taught her on the trail west, her voice high and thin in the cold air. By the end of the first week, the trenches were complete, 40 feet of channels carved into the earth, waiting to be lined with stone. Lena stood at the edge of her work in the fading light, swaying with exhaustion. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her dress hung on her frame like a sail without wind. Her hands were wrapped in bloody rags. Her back felt like someone had taken a hammer to it. 3 weeks, until the ground froze. The trenches were done, but the real work, the stonework, hadn't even begun. She looked at the pile of flat sandstone slabs she'd gathered from the hillside. Each one weighed 20 pounds, 30 pounds. Some weighed 50. She'd carried them down the slope one at a time, stopping every 100 feet to rest, her arms trembling, her legs threatening to buckle. She needed 200 more. Dolores Archuleta appeared on the 8th day. She came on foot, walking the 3 miles from her adobe house with a basket of food and knowledge that no amount of money could buy. She found Elena on her hands and knees in the trenches, fitting stones into place with fingers that shook from cold and exhaustion. "You work too hard." Dolores set down her basket. "You will kill yourself before winter does." "I don't have a choice." "There is always a choice. You could rest, eat, let your body recover." "If I rest, I fall behind. If I fall behind, we freeze." Elena pressed a stone into place. It didn't fit. She removed it, tried another. "The ground will freeze in 3 weeks, maybe less if the weather turns. Everything has to be done by then." Dolores watched her work for a moment. Then she knelt down beside her in the trench. "You are laying the stones wrong." Elena stopped. "What?" "The channels must slope toward the chimney, just a little, 2 fingers of drop over the whole length." Dolores took the stone from Elena's hands and placed it at a slightly different angle. "The smoke must flow. If the channels are level, the smoke will pool. It will find cracks. It will seep up through your floor and fill your house with soot." Elena stared at the stones she had already laid. 12 feet of channel floor, fitted with painstaking care over the past 2 days. All of it level, all of it wrong. "I have to tear it out?" "Only some, the last 4 feet. Dolores patted her shoulder. "It is not so bad. You learn. That is what matters." They worked together for the rest of the day. Dolores showed Elena how to select stones that would withstand thermal cycling, dense, fine-grained sandstone, rather than the porous variety she'd been using. She demonstrated the proper clay mixture for sealing gaps: 2 parts clay, 1 part sand, enough water to make it workable but not wet. She explained the importance of the chimney draft, how the firebox opening and chimney dimensions had to match to ensure proper airflow. "The fire must breathe," she said again and again. "If the fire cannot breathe, you cannot breathe. The smoke will find another way out, through your floor, through cracks in your walls, into your lungs. The gloria is not a fireplace. It is a system. Every piece must work with every other piece." By evening, Elena had relaid the channel floor with the proper slope. Her back screamed. Her hands bled through fresh bandages. But she understood the system now in a way she hadn't before. "Thank you," she said as Dolores prepared to leave. I can never repay you for this. Dolores smiled. In Castile, the women teach each other. That is how the Gloria survived for 700 years. You teach the next woman. That is how you repay me. She walked away into the gathering darkness, leaving Elena with a basket of food, new knowledge, and 2 weeks to finish the impossible. The stone floor went down piece by piece. Each slab had to be carried from the hillside, fitted into place, sealed with clay, then covered with a layer of packed earth and more clay. It was brutal work, made worse by the weather that grew colder each day. Thomas helped fit the smaller stones. His small hands could reach into gaps that Elena's couldn't, pressing clay into crevices, smoothing surfaces. Sarah continued mixing mortar, her feet turning gray with clay dust, her songs growing quieter as the days wore on. The firebox went up on the exterior wall. Elena built it from fieldstone gathered from every corner of the claim, mortaring the stones with the clay mixture Dolores had taught her. The opening was 18 inches wide, 14 inches tall, large enough to feed bundles of grass and brush, small enough to control the burn rate. The iron plate she traded her wedding dress for fit snugly over the opening, hinged so she could lift it to add fuel and close it to regulate airflow. December the 1st. The floor was 3/4 complete. The firebox was finished. The chimney was half built. December 3rd. Temperature dropped to 15 degrees overnight. The ground began to freeze. December 5th. Elena worked by lantern light, laying stones after dark because she'd run out of daylight hours. Thomas fell asleep against the cabin wall, too exhausted to walk to his bedroll. Sarah cried because her feet were cold and she wanted to go inside, but there was no inside, just a construction site open to the weather. December 7th. The chimney was complete. The floor was complete. Every stone fitted, every gap sealed, every channel running true from firebox to chimney with the proper slope. Elena stood in her finished cabin, finished except for the roof she'd barely had time to patch, and looked at the floor she'd built with her own bleeding hands. Gray stone and brown clay, rough compared to Dolores's beautiful tiles, but solid, real, hers. December 8th, the first test. She gathered dried grass from the prairie, corn stalks from the garden, sagebrush from the hillside. She packed it into the firebox until no more would fit. She opened the chimney damper. She lit a match. The grass caught immediately. Flames roared up, hot and eager. Smoke poured into the channels beneath the floor. Elena held her breath. For a terrible moment, smoke seeped up through cracks in the floor, gaps she'd missed, seals that hadn't held. The cabin began to fill with haze, and she heard Whitmore's voice in her head. "You'll smoke yourself out, burn the whole thing down." Then the draft caught. The smoke pulled through the channels, drawn by the rising heat in the chimney. The haze in the cabin thinned, then cleared, clean air. Elena knelt on the floor. The stones were cool against her palms. Then, slowly, so slowly she almost missed it, warm. She stayed there for hours, feeling the warmth spread through the floor like blood through a body. The fire burned for 40 minutes, then died to embers, then to ash. The stones kept warming. 3 hours after the fire went out, the floor was hot to the touch. Elena's children lay on the warm stones, wrapped in blankets, asleep for the first time in weeks without shivering. She sat with her back against the wall and let herself cry. But a test fire in early December was not the same as a winter that hadn't truly arrived. 2 weeks later, the system failed. Elena woke to the sound of cracking stone. A section of floor near the chimney, stones she'd laid during the first week. before Dolores taught her about thermal stress, had split from the heat cycling. Hot during the day, cold at night, hot again, cold again. The porous sandstone couldn't take the expansion and contraction. 3 slabs cracked clean through. Smoke seeped up through the gaps, filling the cabin with haze. She had to tear out the damaged section and replace it with proper stone. 4 days of work she couldn't afford, 4 days of cold while the floor lay open. Thomas developed a cough. Sarah complained of headaches. Elena felt the first stirrings of panic. Real panic, the kind that gripped your chest and wouldn't let go. On the 4th day, Amos Whitmore appeared at her door. He carried a bundle of firewood on his back, half a cord at least, more than Elena could gather in a week. "This isn't charity," he said before she could speak. "You helped my wife last spring when she was sick. Sat with her for 3 days while the fever ran its course. Mrs. Whitmore considers this payment of a debt." Elena looked at the wood. Good wood. Dry. Seasoned. Enough to keep the cabin warm while she finished repairs. Her pride said refuse it. Her children's faces said accept. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." He set the bundle down, straightened up, looked at the damaged floor section, the tools scattered around, the dark circles under Elena's eyes. "I still think this floor contraption is foolishness," he said. "But," he paused, something working in his expression. "If anyone could make foolishness work, it might be you." He left. Elena closed the door against the cold and got back to work. 3 days later, the repairs were complete. New stones properly selected, new seals properly made. The Gloria fired clean and true, smoke pulling through the channels, heat radiating through the floor. It was December 22nd. Deep winter was still coming. The system worked. That was what mattered. Every morning, Elena fired the Gloria with grass and brush and corn stalks. Every evening, the floor radiated gentle, steady heat. Then temperature outside dropped to 10 degrees, then 5, then 0. Inside the Crawford cabin, the floor stayed warm enough to walk on barefoot. Whitmore stopped by the day after Christmas. He said nothing about the Gloria, but he knelt down and placed his palm against the floor. His expression was complicated. "I'll be damned," he muttered. Then, "December isn't the real test, Mrs. Crawford. January is worse. February is even worse than that. Wait until the temperature drops to 20 below. Then we'll see." Reverend Holt visited on Christmas Day. He brought a ham for the children, genuine kindness, Elena believed, though she also recognized an inspection when she saw one. "You've made it this far," he admitted, looking at the warm floor, the sleeping children, the stack of dried grass in the corner where firewood should have been. "But the Lord tests the faithful most severely when they're most confident." Elena said nothing. She was too tired to argue with a man who'd already made up his mind. Samuel Griggs didn't visit at all, but Elena saw him sometimes sitting on his horse on the ridge above her claim, watching, just watching, waiting for nature to prove him right. The first week of January brought warnings. The old-timers at the general store in Las Vegas spoke of winters past, the blizzard of 61 that killed 30 settlers in a single week, the cold snap of 58 that froze cattle standing in the fields. "Sky looks wrong," one of them said, squinting at the horizon. "Got that greenish color. Something's coming." Elena redoubled her fuel gathering. She built stockpiles in every corner of her property, dried grass under the lean-to, corn stalks beneath a tarp, sagebrush piled against the cabin wall. If a storm trapped her, she needed fuel within reach. January 11th dawned clear and almost warm. 32 degrees at noon. Elena let the children play outside for the first time in weeks. She watched them run across the frozen ground, their laughter carrying on the wind, and felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. That night, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. By midnight, the blizzard had begun, and Elena Crawford hadn't yet faced the real test. The blizzard announced itself with a sound like a train bearing down on the cabin. Wind slammed into the walls at 40 miles per hour, finding every gap, every crack, every weakness in the construction. Snow fell so thick and fast that Elena couldn't see her own barn 20 feet away. By dawn on January 12th, the temperature had dropped to 10 degrees below zero. By noon, it was 20 below. By nightfall, the snow had drifted 4 feet against the cabin's north wall, and the temperature was still falling. Elena fired the Gloria at first light. She burned everything she had within reach: dried grass, corn stalks, sagebrush, even some of Whitmore's precious firewood for extra heat. The fire roared in the exterior firebox, hot and hungry, smoke pulling through the channels beneath the floor. Within an hour, the stones were warm. Within 2 hours, they were hot enough that the children could lie directly on them without blankets. The cabin held at 55 degrees, while the world outside turned white and deadly. But the cold wasn't the crisis. Not really. Sarah woke on the second night burning with fever. Elena didn't know what it was. Influenza, perhaps. Pneumonia. Something she'd caught during the weeks of construction, when they'd all been cold and exhausted and eating too little. It didn't matter what it was called. What mattered was that her 4-year-old daughter was burning up from the inside while the temperature outside dropped to 22 degrees below zero. A sick child needed warmth. The Gloria provided that. A sick child needed fluids. Elena melted snow over the heated floor, feeding Sarah sips of water throughout the night. A sick child needed fresh air. That was impossible. Opening the door meant letting in cold that could kill in minutes. A sick child needed medicine. There was none. A sick child needed a doctor. The nearest doctor was 22 miles away in Las Vegas. The roads were impassable. Even if Elena could have reached town, she would have frozen to death before she got halfway. She placed Sarah on the warmest section of floor, directly above where the channels converged near the chimney. She wrapped her daughter in every blanket they owned. She sat beside her through the night, watching, praying, listening to the wind scream outside while her child shivered despite the heat. Thomas sat on the other side, holding his sister's hand. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just held on. The Gloria kept the floor at 70 degrees. It wasn't enough to break a fever, but it was enough to keep a sick child from shivering into exhaustion. It was enough to let her body fight. That first night, Elena didn't sleep at all. The second day was worse. Sarah's fever spiked in the afternoon. She became delirious, crying out for her father, asking why he wouldn't come, begging him to make the cold go away. Elena held her and rocked her and told her everything would be all right, but the words felt hollow in her mouth. William was dead. The storm showed no sign of stopping, and her daughter was burning up. Elena fired the Gloria twice that day, something she'd never done before. The floor temperature rose to 80 degrees, almost too warm for comfort, but Sarah stopped shivering. Her body relaxed. She slept. Outside, the wind continued to howl. Elena checked her fuel stockpile. The lean-to was buried under 4 feet of snow. The sagebrush pile against the cabin wall had been scattered by the wind. What remained inside, 2 days' worth, maybe 3, was all she could reach without going outside. She calculated. If the storm lasted 2 more days, she would be fine. If it lasted 4 days, she would run out. If it lasted 6 days. She refused to finish the thought. On the morning of the third day, Elena made a decision. She dressed in every piece of clothing she owned. 3 pairs of stockings, 2 dresses layered over each other, William's old coat, which hung to her knees, a scarf wrapped around her face until only her eyes showed, mittens over gloves over bandaged hands. She found a rope in the corner of the cabin, 20 feet of hemp line they'd used to secure the wagon on the trail west. She tied one end around her waist. She tied the other end to the doorframe. Thomas watched her with wide eyes. "Mama? What are you doing?" "I need to get more fuel from the lean-to. The rope will help me find my way back." "But you can't go out there. You'll freeze." "I'll only be a few minutes." She pulled him close, felt his thin arms wrap around her. "Watch your sister. Keep her warm. I'll be right back." She opened the door. The cold hit her like a physical blow. 22 degrees below. 0. Wind that cut through every layer she wore. Snow so thick she couldn't see the lean-to. Couldn't see anything except white chaos swirling in all directions. She stepped outside and immediately lost all sense of direction. The rope went taut behind her. That was the only thing that told her which way the cabin lay. She turned her back to the pull of the rope and walked forward, one step at a time, snow up to her thighs, wind trying to knock her down with every gust. 10 steps. The lean-to should be 20 feet away. She should have reached it by now. 15 steps. Nothing. Just white. 20 steps. Her foot struck something solid. Wood. The lean-to wall. She felt along the structure until she found the opening. Inside, partially sheltered from the wind, she found the brush pile she'd stacked there weeks ago. Half of it was frozen solid, buried under snow that had blown in through gaps in the walls. But half was still usable. She filled a burlap sack with as much dried grass and brush as she could carry. 30 pounds. 40. Enough for 2 more days if she was careful. The trip back was harder. She had to pull herself along the rope hand over hand, fighting against wind that seemed determined to tear her away from everything she loved. Her fingers went numb inside her mittens. Her face burned where the scarf had slipped. She couldn't feel her feet, but she could see the cabin now, a dark shape in the white chaos. The door was still open, Thomas standing in it, watching for her, ready to pull her inside. She fell through the doorway. Thomas slammed the door behind her. The relative warmth of the cabin, 55 degrees, 100 degrees warmer than outside, felt like an embrace. She lay on the warm floor and let the stones give back the heat they'd been holding. Feeling returned to her extremities. Painful at first, then merely uncomfortable, then almost normal. Sarah was still sleeping, still feverish, but still breathing. Elena had bought them 2 more days. That night, the storm finally began to weaken. The wind dropped from a scream to a moan. The snow slowed. By morning, patches of gray sky showed through the clouds. And Sarah's fever broke. Elena woke to find her daughter sitting up, asking for water and food. Her forehead was cool to the touch. Her eyes were clear. Whatever had gripped her, influenza, pneumonia, something else, had loosened its hold. "Mama," Sarah's voice was small and raspy. "Why is the floor so warm?" Elena laughed. It came out as a sob. She pulled her daughter close and held her until Thomas woke up and demanded to know what was happening, and then she held them both while the gray light of dawn crept through the frosted windows. The storm had lasted 3 days. The temperature had dropped to 25 below 0 at its worst. Elena's fuel supply was almost gone. Her body ached from exhaustion and cold, and she hadn't slept more than a few hours in 72 hours. But her children were alive. Her cabin was warm. The Gloria had done exactly what Dolores Archuleta said it would do, stored the heat from quick, hot fires, and released it slowly through the stones, keeping the floor above 60 degrees even when the world outside tried to freeze everything solid. Elena opened the door and looked out at the changed landscape. Snow drifted higher than her head against the north wall. The barn was half buried. The lean-to had collapsed under the weight. But her chimney was clear. Her family was alive. She stood in the doorway, exhausted beyond measure, and let herself hope that the worst was over. 3 miles away, the Whitmore cabin had survived, barely. Amos Whitmore had rationed his firewood from the second day of the storm, burning only enough to keep the temperature above freezing. His wife and children had worn their coats indoors, huddled together for warmth, watching frost form on the inside walls. By the third day, they'd started burning furniture. 5 miles south, the Peterson family had run out of wood entirely. They'd burned chairs, then a table, then floorboards torn up from the corners of their cabin. They'd survived, but their home was gutted. It would take months to repair. And 6 miles east, in a cabin that stood alone on a windswept ridge, Jacob Hendricks had not survived at all. He was a bachelor, 43 years old, a quiet man who kept to himself and bothered no one. He'd arrived in the territory 2 years earlier with plans to raise cattle. His woodpile had been adequate for a normal winter, 5 cords stacked against his cabin wall. This hadn't been a normal winter. Search parties found him 8 days after the storm ended. He'd frozen in his chair, wrapped in every blanket he owned, his woodpile empty, his fire long dead. The cold had taken him some time on the second day, they reckoned. He'd been alone. No one had known to check on him. Reverend Holt performed the burial service on a bitter January morning. Elena attended along with most of the settlement. She stood at the edge of the gathering and looked at the frozen ground where Jacob Hendricks would spend eternity, and she thought about mathematics. 8 cords of wood for a normal winter. 5 cords wasn't enough. Reverend Holt's numbers had been right, but she'd made it through with dried grass and corn stalks and sagebrush. She'd heated her cabin with fuel that Jacob Hendricks had probably walked past 1,000 times without seeing. The difference between life and death, it turned out, wasn't always about having more. Sometimes it was about knowing something different. Amos Whitmore came to her cabin 3 days after the storm. He walked the whole 3 miles through snow that reached his waist in places. His face was red from cold, his breath steaming in the air, his eyes holding something Elena had never seen there before: uncertainty. He found her children playing in the warm cabin, Sarah fully recovered, running back and forth across the heated floor in bare feet. He found the fuel supply, just bundles of dried grass stacked in the corner. He found Elena herself sitting by the window, mending a shirt, looking more rested than she had in months. Mrs. Crawford. He stood in the doorway, hat in his hands. May I come in? Of course, Mr. Whitmore. He stepped inside and immediately felt the warmth rising from the floor. He knelt down and placed his palm against the stone, the same way he had months ago when he declared the whole enterprise foolishness. How warm does this stay? His voice was quiet. After the fire goes out? 12 hours, sometimes more if I build the fire large. And you heated through the whole storm with this? 3 days of 20 below temperatures? 2 fires a day during the worst of it. Grass and brush mostly. A little of the wood you brought me. He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Mrs. Crawford, I owe you an apology. Elena set down her mending. Mr. Whitmore, no, let me say this. He stood up, but he didn't meet her eyes. He looked at the floor, at the children, at the bundles of grass in the corner. I called this foolishness. I said you'd smoke yourself out or burn the place down. I said a woman couldn't build a heating system. He finally looked at her. I was wrong about all of it. You were trying to protect me, protect my children. I was trying to make you fit what I knew, what I understood. He shook his head. My family nearly froze, Mrs. Crawford. We burned our dining table. My wife cried for 3 days straight because she thought our children were going to die. His voice cracked. And the whole time you were 3 miles away, warm as spring, heating your cabin with grass. Mr. Whitmore, would you teach me? The question came out in a rush, as if he was afraid he'd lose his nerve. Would you teach me how to build one of these? I can't. I won't let my family go through that again. Not when there's another way. Elena looked at this man who had dismissed her, doubted her, walked away from her when she needed help most. She remembered his words. Then help me dig, Mr. Whitmore, or leave me to it. She remembered him leaving, but she also remembered the firewood he'd brought. Half a cord, enough to get her through the repair crisis. Payment for a debt, he'd called it. But it had been more than that. It had been a man admitting, in the only way he knew how, that maybe he'd been wrong. I'll teach you, she said. But you have to understand, it's not just about digging trenches and laying stones. It's about understanding the system, how the fire breathes, how the stone holds heat, how everything works together. I'll learn. It took me 6 weeks to build this, and I had Dolores Archuleta teaching me. You'll need to start this summer if you want to be ready for next winter. Then I'll start this summer. Elena nodded. Come back in April. Bring paper. I'll draw you diagrams. Whitmore put his hat back on. He paused at the door, looking back at the warm floor, the playing children, the woman who had done the impossible. Mrs. Crawford? Yes? You said something to me once. When I told you this was foolishness, you said, if anyone could make foolishness work, it might be you. A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. You were right about that, too. He left. Elena watched him wade through the snow toward his own claim, then turned back to her mending. 1 down, 2 to go. Reverend Marcus Holt arrived the following Sunday. He came directly from Jacob Hendricks's burial, still wearing his formal black coat, still carrying his Bible. His face was gray with exhaustion, and something else, something that looked like doubt eating away at certainty. Elena met him at the door. She didn't invite him in immediately. She wanted him to ask. Mrs. Crawford, his voice was hoarse. I wonder if I might, if you would permit me to. Come in, Reverend, the floor is warm. He stepped inside. She watched his reaction, the same reaction everyone had. The surprise at the heat rising from below, the confusion at the absence of a fire, the slow realization that everything he had assumed was wrong. I've been to the Hendricks place, he said quietly. I've seen what happens when the mathematics... He trailed off. When the mathematics don't account for other possibilities? Elena finished for him. Yes. He looked at her. His eyes were wet. Mrs. Crawford, I told you there was no other way, that mathematics demanded you either leave or marry Samuel Griggs. I told you a woman alone couldn't survive a winter here. You did. I was wrong. The words seemed to cost him something. God provided another way. Through that old woman, through your own labor, through something I'd never seen and refused to believe in. He gestured at the warm floor. The mathematics were mine, not God's. I was too blind to see it. You were trying to help, Reverend. You've buried 17 settlers. You know what winter does to people who aren't prepared. I was trying to make you fit a formula. He shook his head. You refused. You built your own formula. And because you did, your children are alive. and Jacob Hendricks is in the ground. Elena didn't have an answer for that. The comparison wasn't fair. Jacob Hendricks hadn't known about the Gloria, hadn't had Dolores Archuleta to teach him, hadn't had the same opportunities or information, but she understood what the Reverend was trying to say. She'd found a way. He should have helped her find it instead of telling her it didn't exist. "May I examine the system?" Holt asked. "I'd like to understand how it works." Elena showed him everything: the exterior firebox, the underfloor channels, the chimney that drew the smoke through. She explained the thermal mass of the stone, the importance of the proper slope, the technique of burning hot and fast rather than slow and steady. She answered every question. When she was finished, the Reverend stood in silence for a long moment. "This should be in every homestead in the territory," he said finally. "Every cabin, every house. If the settlers knew about this, they can know. I'll teach anyone who wants to learn. Would you let me help spread the word? I visit every homestead in the valley. I could tell people about what you've built, what's possible." Elena nodded. "Tell them to come see for themselves. I'll show anyone who asks." The Reverend moved toward the door, then paused. "Mrs. Crawford, may I ask you something?" "Of course." "When I told you it was impossible, when everyone told you it was impossible, how did you keep going? How did you believe in something no one else believed in?" Elena thought about the question. She thought about the night she'd lain awake, doubting everything, the morning she'd woken with bleeding hands, and an aching back, wondering if the skeptics were right, the moments when she'd looked at her children and felt the weight of their lives on her shoulders. "I didn't always believe," she said finally. "There were times I was certain I was going to fail, certain we were going to freeze." She looked at the floor, at the stones she'd laid with her own hands. "But I didn't have the luxury of doubt. My children needed me to succeed, so I kept working, even when I didn't believe, and eventually the work made it true." The Reverend nodded slowly. "Faith without works is dead," he said, "but perhaps works without faith is enough, if the works are sufficient." "Perhaps," Elena said, "or perhaps the work creates the faith." He left. Elena closed the door against the cold and stood for a moment in the warmth of her own creation, wondering if that was true. Word spread through the valley like fire through dry grass. Through February and March, settlers came to Elena's cabin, sometimes one or two at a time, sometimes groups of 5 or 6. They came on horseback and on foot, through snow and through mud as the spring thaw began. They came with questions, with skepticism, with desperate hope. Elena taught them all. She drew diagrams in the dirt and then on paper when paper could be found. She explained channel depth and stone selection and chimney draft. She showed them the Gloria in operation, the quick hot fire, the smoke flowing through the channels, the heat radiating from the floor hours after the flames died. She answered the same questions over and over. How deep do the channels need to be? 8 inches minimum, 12 inches better. What kind of stone? Dense, fine-grained, nothing porous. Test it by pouring water on it. If the water soaks in, the stone will crack. How long does the heat last? 12 hours if you fire it properly, sometimes more. Can you really heat with grass? Anything that burns hot and fast. Grass, brush, stalks, chips. Wood if you have it, but you don't need it. By spring, 3 families had started building glorias of their own. The Whitmores broke ground in April, following diagrams Elena had drawn for them. The Martins started in May. The Delacroix family, French-Canadian immigrants who'd arrived the previous fall, began construction in June. Dolores Archuleta came to see Elena in late March. She walked the 3 miles through the last of the winter snow, her face creased with a smile. I hear you are teaching half the valley, she said. I'm teaching anyone who asks. Good. Dolores patted her hand. This is how it should be. In Castile, the women teach each other. That is how the Gloria survived for 700 years. Now it will survive here too. Because of you, Elena said. You taught me. Without me, you would have found another way. Dolores shrugged. You are that kind of woman, the kind who finds ways. Elena wasn't sure that was true, but she liked hearing it. Samuel Griggs never came to learn. Elena saw him at the general store in late March, the first time she'd made the 22-mile trip to Las Vegas since before the storm. He was buying supplies, salt, flour, ammunition. He looked the same as ever, well-fed, well-dressed, confident in the way men are confident when they've never had to doubt themselves. Their eyes met across the store. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Griggs walked over. Mrs. Crawford. His voice was flat. No warmth, no threat, just acknowledgement of a fact. You survived the winter. I did, Mr. Griggs. I hear you're teaching that Mexican trick to half the valley. Spanish. Elena didn't blink. And yes, I am. He leaned closer. His breath smelled of whiskey, even in the morning. You got lucky. One lucky winter doesn't prove anything. Next year could be worse. The year after that, worse still. Perhaps. You'll fail eventually. They all do. Women alone on claims too big for them. You'll run out of luck or energy or both. And when you do, he smiled. The offer might still be open if you ask nicely. Elena picked up her supplies, salt, coffee, a bag of nails for repairs. She met his eyes one final time. Mr. Griggs, my husband has been dead for 18 months. I've survived 2 winters alone. I've built a heating system with my own hands that outperformed every cabin in this valley during the worst storm in a decade. She moved toward the door. I think we both know that offer expired a long time ago. She walked out. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Behind her, Samuel Griggs stood in silence, watching her go. The storekeeper would later say he'd never seen a man look so angry and so helpless at the same time. The second winter proved the Gloria wasn't luck. January of 1867 brought another cold snap, the one that opened this story, with Whitmore stumbling through the snow expecting to find frozen corpses, and instead finding a warm cabin and playing children. By then, 5 homesteads in the Cañada Bonita Valley had Gloria systems. All 5 stayed warm through the storm. All 5 families survived without crisis. Elena tracked the numbers. Traditional wood-heated cabins during the January 67 cold snap. Interior temperatures of 35 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, with constant fires burning. Gloria, heated cabins during the same period. Interior temperatures of 55 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, with 1 or 2 firings per day. Fuel consumption for traditional heating, 8 to 12 cords of wood per winter, requiring 40 to 60 days of cutting and hauling labor. Fuel consumption for Gloria. Heating. The equivalent of 2 to 3 cords of brush and grass, requiring 5 to 8 days of gathering. The mathematics that Reverend Holt had wielded like a weapon, the mathematics that said a woman alone couldn't survive, had been replaced by different mathematics entirely. Better mathematics. Mathematics that didn't require a husband or a fortune in firewood. Mathematics that Elena had written with her own bleeding hands. Elena Crawford remained on her homestead until her death in 1914, at the age of 80. She never remarried. Offers came, in the years after that first winter, men who saw a capable woman, a proven survivor, a desirable partner. She declined them all. Not out of loyalty to William's memory, though she did think of him often, but because she'd proven something to herself in that first terrible winter, something she never needed to prove again. She could survive on her own. She didn't need saving. Thomas grew up on the claim and eventually took it over, expanding the original 160 acres to 400 by the time he was 40. He married a school teacher from Las Vegas and had 4 children. He kept the Gloria in operation until 1922, when his own children finally convinced him to install a modern coal stove. When they did, they found the underfloor channels still intact. The stones were blackened with 60 years of soot, but solid, perfectly preserved, a testament to a mother's desperation and a neighbor's ancient knowledge. Sarah became a school teacher herself, one of the first women teachers in the New Mexico territory. She taught in Las Vegas for 37 years, until her retirement in 1918. In her classroom, she kept a small flat stone on her desk. When students asked about it, she told them it was a piece of the floor her mother built with her bare hands. A reminder, she said, that the impossible becomes possible when you refuse to believe otherwise. The Gloria heating system spread through the Sangre de Cristo foothills in the 1870s and 1880s. At its peak, perhaps 30 to 40 homesteads used variations of Elena's design adapted to their own materials and circumstances. Anglo settlers built them with fieldstone. Hispano families refined them with proper clay tiles. Each version was different. Each version worked. But the railroad arrived in 1879, bringing cheap coal from the east. Manufactured iron stoves became affordable. What had once required weeks of labor and careful knowledge could now be purchased for a few dollars at the general store. By 1900, most glorias in the territory had been abandoned, filled in with dirt, paved over with wood floors, forgotten. The knowledge that Dolores Archuleta had carried from Castile, that Elena Crawford had learned and spread and refined, it faded from memory like smoke dissipating in the wind. The technology wasn't lost, not entirely. In rural Castile, in villages near Burgos, glorias continued to be fired every morning, just as they had been for 700 years. The expression estar en la gloria, to be in the gloria, still meant to be happy and comfortable, though most speakers had forgotten why. And in the late 20th century, sustainable building enthusiasts began rediscovering what Elena Crawford had figured out in 1865. They called it radiant floor heating. They praised it as one of the most energy-efficient methods available. They published papers and designed systems and charged consulting fees to teach what a desperate widow had taught her neighbors for free. The glory was never in the wood. That was what Elena understood, what Dolores had taught her, what the settlers of Cañada Bonita learned through one terrible winter. The glory was in the stones that remembered the fire. The glory was in the knowledge passed from woman to woman, generation to generation, surviving centuries because someone took the time to teach it. The glory was in refusing to accept that the mathematics were fixed, that the only options were the ones other people offered. That survival required surrendering to someone else's formula. January, present day. A sustainable homestead stands in the Sangre de Cristo foothills, not far from where Cañada Bonita once existed. The cabin is modern, solar panels on the roof, insulated walls, double-paned windows, but beneath the floor, channels run in a familiar pattern. Stone ducts, blackened with use, carrying heat from a simple firebox on the exterior wall. A woman kneels on the warm stone. She's been researching the history of this valley, digging through homestead records and census data, collecting oral histories from the descendants of Dolores Archuleta. She's trying to understand how a technology 700 years old came to this place and then vanished, and what it means that people are building it again. She places her palm flat against the floor. 74 degrees, 12 hours after the last fire. Outside, the temperature is 8 below zero. Wind rattles the windows. Snow falls in sheets across the valley, just as it fell on Elena Crawford and her children 158 years ago. Inside, the floor radiates warmth. The stones remember. The woman thinks about Elena Crawford, about Dolores Archuleta, about all the settlers who learned and taught and survived because someone refused to accept that the mathematics were impossible. She thinks about Jacob Hendricks, frozen in his chair because no one told him there was another way. She thinks about the knowledge lost and found and lost again, passed down and forgotten and rediscovered. She thinks about glory. The word in Spanish means exactly what it sounds like, not just comfort or warmth or survival. Glory, the divine light that fills a space and transforms it, the presence of something greater than yourself. Elena Crawford didn't believe in herself, not always. There were nights she doubted everything. Mornings she was certain she would fail. Moments she looked at her children and wondered if the skeptics were right, if she was gambling their lives on foolishness. But she kept working, kept digging, kept laying stones and sealing gaps and firing the system until it proved itself true. Faith without works is dead. Works without faith may be enough if the works are sufficient. Or perhaps the work creates the faith. Perhaps the glory comes not from believing, but from building, from placing your hands against the cold stone and feeling hours later the warmth that your own labor put there. The woman on the floor closes her eyes. She feels the heat rising through her palms, through her body, into the cold air around her. Glory, she whispers. The stones hold the answer. They always have.